Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today we're going to be playing a new game which has been out for about a month, maybe two, called Rule the Waves, Naval Arms Races and Naval Battles 1900 to 1925. It's another game put out by Frederick Wallen and published on the NWS website. I think that's Naval Warfare Simulations. And the game is a development upon the Steam and Iron series. The Steam and Iron series is the previous game made by Frederick Wallen, which looks at the First World War from a tactical side. Basically, you can refight World War I battles or engagements in that game in Steam and Iron. Rule the Waves is a little bit different. In this game, it's actually kind of a grand strategy and a tactical battle simulator. It puts you in the shoes of one of the admirals of the great powers during the age, or the period from 1900 to 1925. Here are the nations that you can play as. You can play as Great Britain, as Germany, France, Austria-Hungary, Russia, at Italy, the United States, or Japan. You also have the option of playing as a hypothetical Confederate States or as kind of a fallen great power in Spain. Spain obviously isn't a hypothetical, but it's not included in the traditional great powers because during this time period, by 1900, Spain had already lost all of its colonies, and most recently to the United States in the Spanish-American War in 1898. And as a result, Spain really didn't play much of a role in the naval arms races during this era and time, but you can still play as them if you'd like. Again, you can even play as a hypothetical Confederate States of America, assuming that the Confederacy had won the American Civil War. Now, each nation has its own different traits. Again, as I said, you're going to take on the role of a Grand Admiral in one of the fleets of one of these navies. So each navy does have different traits that do set it apart from the others. So for example, if you're going to play as Britain, you kind of get a summary. You're Great Britain. Your leader is a prime minister, so that the type of government that you have is a liberal democracy. If you compare that, for example, with Germany, they've got a limited democracy. But Great Britain then their build area is kind of the Northern Europe region. It tells you what their historical budget and their game budget is. They're a global naval power, which has some implications on gameplay. For example, that means they have to keep a certain amount of their fleet on foreign stations. They can't just bulk it all up in Great Britain. They've got to kind of patrol the world sea lanes, kind of resembling Britain's role, which the United States kind of has today, where their job is, or largely is, to keep the sea lanes open for commerce and also to protect British colonies. They're a technology leader, which gives them kind of research and development boosts. They've got an efficient shipbuilding industry, which allows them to build things more quickly, warships more quickly. If you look at Italy, they don't have that. They're an inconsistent naval policy. Italy, actually, let's look at Japan. They have an underdeveloped shipbuilding industry, which means they build things more slowly, as opposed to Britain, which build things more fastly. Hidden flaws also allows the British to kind of more easily identify problems with their designs and fix them rather than sudden surprises coming up. If you have a poor shipbuilding industry, you could potentially design a ship to be 20 knots and maybe it'll only make 18 after you end up building it. Great Britain also has a research advantage in their ship design, and then they also start with certain gun types that are already unlocked. So they can build as large as a 13-inch gun, where if you look at Japan, for example, they can only build 10-inch guns. So that's just kind of giving you a picture of the game's kind of nation selection screen, where you can see all these different nations have different traits. For example, Russia has poor education and an underdeveloped shipbuilding industry. Italy has an inconsistent naval policy, which might mean that their budget fluctuates a lot more. Countries also have limits on their dock sizes, and you also see oil as another trait which plays a role in nations' ability to build warships that rely on oil fuel. So, for example, no one starts with oil right now, but if you have oil before 1920 in one of your colonies, then you can actually build oil-powered ships before crude oil becomes a more widely dispersed commodity. Now in this game, again, you play a Grand Admiral in charge of the fleet, and we're going to play as Japan. I think it's a nation that has a lot of interesting characteristics, so we're going to go ahead and play as Japan. You'll see the nations that are going to be playing against us are going to be Germany, Britain, France, Russia, the United States, and Italy. just all the other nations on the map here. Go ahead and hit OK, and then you can see at this point we're presented with some options. We can choose the fleet size, so if we want things to be more manageable or easy, we could pick a small fleet size, which would give us a smaller budget, and all other nations likewise would have a smaller budget. We can also choose historical resources, which impacts where resources are on the map, as well as a manual build of our legacy fleet. We're going to uncheck historical resources because I think it'll be fun to kind of have things pop up randomly. We're going to go ahead and set fleet sizes to very large. One thing about this game is fleets tend to be a little bit smaller than they were historically, but I am going to go ahead and try and play with the very large setting to get things to as close as possible to reality, to what they actually were. And then we'll go ahead and I guess why don't we rename our Admiral HG for Historical Gamer, and then we'll go ahead and we'll get started. So now what you can see here is we're on the kind of the main gameplay screen, and at this point we're being prompted to build our existing fleet because I did choose to design our starting navy. So we can go ahead and hit OK. You can see we have no ships currently. This is our in service. We have no ships currently in service. We have no ships under construction, no submarines. We do start with a few base coastal fortifications. You can see we've got 4 batteries of either 4 or 6-inch coastal batteries, all in Japan. We can expand that as well. And we haven't lost any ships sunk yet either. In addition to that, up here we've also got an option to view the map. So we've got a map of the world right now, and you can see here there are different colonies in different regions. There's like 11 different regions, or maybe it's 12 different regions in the globe, and there are different colonies or different areas in the globe. So you can see here, if we zoom in, if we go into the Caribbean region, the U.S. has control over Guantanamo Bay in Cuba and Puerto Rico. There are also neutral areas in the Virgin Islands. You can see here the value is limited, base capacity is limited, no oil, and there are a couple of starting ports, but it's a neutral territory. Rather, if we look at Jamaica, you can see here this is owned by Great Britain, and also has a list of its value and its base capacity and ports as well. Now, one thing to keep in mind is the neutral areas, for example, Venezuela, which is a neutral country, while it is neutral, it is possible that these can change sides. So the game doesn't directly deal with the race to Africa. By this time, by the 1900 starting point of this game, most of the colonial expansion is at an end. There are a few exceptions. For example, Libya would fall to the Italians in a war against the Ottoman Empire. But for the most part, most of colonizing Africa was already accomplished by this point. You can see here there are different colonies and bases littered all over the globe for different empires. China has several. Actually, China could have a lot more than what it does, but just for simplification purposes, you can see here there aren't a ton. And again, you can expand your empire through random events, which will allow you to take over neutral countries, or if you fight one of the great powers and you win, then you can gain control of the colonies of that great power as a result of the settlement of a war. But the actual neutral countries you cannot directly attack. All you can do is kind of hope that a random event will allow it to shift either into your side or potentially into the other country's side as well. You've also got a list of possessions or ships here on the left side of the map. You can see no ships yet here, but if we click the possessions, you kind of get a drop down of the different possessions in the different regions. If you have ships, you've got the same option where you click the drop down and it'll show all your ships in that region. Now, some regions, depending on your country and your colonial interests, will require you to base a certain number of ships in another region. Southeastern Asia, for example, we have a 5,000 marker, which means we need to have 5,000 tons of shipping in Southeast Asia. This is the Southeast Asia section of the map, and you can see the reason we have to have that there is because we have the colony of Formosa, which I didn't click on right. Okay, so you can see here Formosa is a Japanese colony and is important enough to us that it requires 5,000 tons. The required tonnage differs also depending on the fleet sizes as well. And you've got a spattering of different Pacific atolls and other regions in the area. Now, as Japan, we're probably going to be spending the majority of our time focusing kind of on Southeast Asia and on Northeast Asia. That would be my guess. I doubt we'll be spending much time looking at the South Pacific or the Indian Ocean, at least not initially. My initial goals as Japan is to try and start a limited war with just Russia, so we can try and take the Latong Peninsula, which is where Port Arthur was, or is, I guess they changed the name though, and also is where the 1905 Russo-Japanese War was fought over. In addition to that, I'd like to try and take Northern Korea, but that's also going to depend on random events. That's one thing that's a little bit annoying with this game, is that it would seem you should be able to take over certain neutral territories based on what happened historically, and based on the actual spheres of influence and whatnot. But the game really just makes it really, really random, so it's hard to really control your destiny in that sense. Keep in mind, you're not the emperor, you're not the king, you're not the dictator of your country, you are the grand admiral. So determining if you're going to go to war is really not up to you. This game is in a very real sense, plays like a RPG, where you take on the role of the Grand Admiral. You can influence world tensions. You can influence the likelihood of a conflict with a great power by some of the responses that you have to different events that come up. Tirpitz, for example, is a very bellicose admiral in the German side and really helped to drive that anti-British sentiment in Germany, and also drove the British to kind of their anti-German sentiment as well as the Kaiser. And, that had a big influence on the rising animosity between the two sides. So as the admiral, you can influence tensions greatly, and you have a large degree of control, but you will also have things that come up where, it's like the prime minister or whoever's asking, hey, should we do this? What do you think? And then you're responding largely as like a joint chief official would, where they're saying, hey, are you strong enough to go to war with this country if we ask you? And, your responses to that can influence this. Now, I've already kind of mentioned here on the right side of the screen, we've got the tension levels. So as these levels rise up closer to this line up at the very top, you get more likely to be at war with the given countries. Everybody starts pretty low in 1900, but as events come up and things change throughout the game, these levels can go up and can go down. In addition to that, you've also got the ability to gather intelligence on all the different great powers. So for example, we can go ahead and increase these figures to low. But keep in mind, if we look down here, and I'll talk a little bit more about the budget screen in a second, the intelligence budget is part of your monthly balance or your monthly budget. So the more you spend on intelligence, if you rack it up real high, you're going to have a much higher intelligence budget than if you keep things kind of low. Now, intelligence is important because you can get intel reports on kind of what other countries are doing, what ships they're laying down, how effective their armaments are, how they compare to you, and there's even the ability to have espionage where you can steal certain technologies from a rival. So that is something that the intelligence budget will influence that. Also, a higher intelligence budget against a different country could lead to spies getting caught in that country and could influence tension levels as well. So you need to keep that in mind. It's not a great idea just to rack intel efforts all the way up, because that increases your likelihood of increasing tensions and eventually a war against that country if you're not careful. Now, since we're already on the topic of budgets, why don't we go ahead and take a real quick look at the budgets and kind of the breakdown of how that works. So the yearly budget for us is 129 million yen, dollars, whatever. The monthly budget, that breaks down divided by 12, strictly down to $10 million a month that we have to spend on our Navy. And again, you're in the role of a Grand Admiral in charge of the fleet, so managing your budget is a big part of this game. Now, you're given a maintenance cost for the fleet that you have. Keep in mind, at the moment, we have no fleet. The only maintenance costs we have pertain to our shore batteries. So we have a very limited maintenance budget at the moment. You also have a construction cost, which every month, ships that are under construction cost differing amounts depending on the ship. You will find that the total cost of the ship is divided by the number of months that it's expected to take to build, which gives you your construction cost per month. All of these figures are monthly costs, with the exception of the yearly budget at the very top and the funds amount at the bottom. Everything else is on a monthly basis. You've got research costs, which reference the attempt or the technological research that you're doing. We can't look at the research section quite yet because we're in that initial building ship screen, but we can look at that in a little bit more detail later. But basically, there's a cost that is associated with your scientists trying to develop new technologies, build dreadnoughts, build 13-inch guns, 14-inch guns, etc. You can also enhance your training. That's another thing we can't look at until we get the game underway. But you can increase your training costs to make your crews more proficient at certain items. But again, until you do that, there's not going to be a cost, or if you do that, there's an additional cost. If you choose not to, then you don't. And then you have your intelligence budget, which we already mentioned is influenced by how you kind of fiddle around with these sliders over here. And then you've just got a summary at the bottom which says total expenses. That's subtracted out of your monthly budget, and you get a monthly balance. So right now with no Navy, we would pocket $9 million per month. You also have a kind of a slush fund or a total fund that's available to your Navy down at the bottom. This number is very high, obviously, right now, over $500 million. That's over 4 years, actually almost 5 years of spending at our current budget level that we can choose to build our starting fleet with. That's not something that is going to remain that high. In fact, you can't carry more than $24 million into the start of the game anyway, so you really do need to build up that initial fleet, which we will be doing here in a little bit. So since we just went through the budget, we'll look at the last item on the screen we haven't really looked at yet. There are a few other things like messages and intel reports, which we don't have anything of yet. There's also an almanac, which I'll talk a little bit more about when the game starts, but basically it just shows you the general force breakdowns of the different fleets and the different powers that are currently in play, as well as the total naval budgets, their total tonnages, etc. But again, that's all zeroed out right now because no one has built their fleets yet. The other item we haven't really talked about on the screen yet, though, is the prestige and all of this stuff here on the left. So the prestige is just kind of a general measure of how you're doing. If you let this figure get too low, then what ends up happening is you can get fired as from your role in Grand Admiral and essentially lose the game. The important thing is you want to build the prestige up, but you need to be a little bit careful with how you do that, because generally items that give you prestige also increase tensions and unrest. So if you increase tensions too much, then you end up in a war, and if you lose the war, then obviously you lose prestige. So gaining 1 or 2 prestige to do something might not always be your best move. The other item here is the tonnage on foreign stations. So basically this just represents what we already talked about up here, that we need to have 5,000 tons of warships on foreign stations, which we will have once we build our ships. There's a dock size, which is the largest warship that you can build domestically. Now, one thing that I think this game does really well and pretty neatly is the aspect of building ships in foreign yards, which has political concerns and strategic concerns that you need to be aware of as a player, but that's just a really neat feature, I think, that you can choose to build ships in Great Britain, in France, in Germany, but you also, if, for example, Japan can't build large enough warships domestically, they can choose to build those in Great Britain like they did historically, or in France, or in Germany. But then that you also need to keep that in mind is that if you go to war with one of the countries that's building some of your ships, they can seize those ships and then you lose them. So not always the best strategy to build overseas, but in some situations for countries like Spain or Japan, it's often an appealing option to build larger warships than you otherwise could. Also, the other nice aspect is if another country has more advanced technologies, then you can build ships in those other countries, and you can take advantage of maybe some technologies you haven't yet built yourself to get you perhaps a better ship than you otherwise would be able to. There's also an unrest level, which just kind of represents the general kind of populace contentment for what you're doing in your own country. If this gets too high, you could have a rebellion and lose as well. And there's a few other things here. There's some build requirements. So in certain circumstances, there may be requirements on what you actually build. Build requirements is a different one. I haven't actually seen that be used yet. It could be one of two things. It could be for requirements that are placed upon you as a result of an arms limitation treaty where you're not able to build certain types of ships, or it could be requirements that are placed on you by your government saying you have to build a certain number of ships. Again, I haven't seen that used in either case yet, and the manual doesn't specifically address the build requirements tab, so we'll see what comes up with that in our gameplay. I did reference treaties. There's treaty time limits. That's basically the number of months that certain treaties are in force. So from time to time, you may have an arms limitation treaty that all the great powers get together and sign. And what that basically means is you might have a limitation, for example, that no ship is to exceed 12,000 tons or 10 inches in terms of its main battery's gun armament. And, in those situations, they have a certain number of time or a certain number of months that those treaties remain in force, after which you can build whatever you want, unless the treaty is extended, which is possible. But basically, this field here only applies if there's an arms limitation treaty that comes up, and there are also peace treaties that you can sign after having a war. You may have a peace treaty for a certain number of months, and then you can't go to war with that country for a certain number of months, and again, that would show up here. So that just about does it for all kind of just the main screen stuff. There's a few other things, mobilization, training, research, that would all come up later in the game. You can also build submarines. Similar to when you build ships, you choose the class and the number you want to build. The only difference is right now no countries start with submarine technology, so that's kind of a dead button for a few years. You can build new forts. So, for example, you could choose to build 2 forts. You could have a 10-inch coastal battery, put it in Japan, and then you get a monthly build cost. You'll see here it'll take 10 months. It'll cost $12 million. That's $1.2 million per turn, $50,000 maintenance cost after it's constructed. Or you could just build 1 fort, but yeah, the cost doesn't change based on the number of forts you build. It does change based on the size of the fort. So a 10-inch coastal battery is probably going to be more effective with dealing with capital ships. A 4-inch battery probably less effective, but we're not really worried about the forts at the moment. What we do need to do is we do need to build our fleet. So that's the next thing that we need to go ahead and do. Now, as you see here, when you click on the build, you have a class option, a type, a displacement, a year. The year stands for the year that the ship was designed. The displacement obviously is the tonnage that the ship is, which comes into play with your dock size, the type of warship, and the class name. As you design more ships, they will all kind of show up here, but right now we don't have any designs. So the first thing we're going to have to do is design a ship. But one last thing, you saw here our dock size is 10,000 tons. We can actually choose to expand that. So for example, we can click build, we'll spend 3.2 million, and it'll give us larger docks. I believe it expands your dock size by 2,000 tons when you do that, so it would go up to 12,000, which would still put us behind the game when you compare it with Europe. But one other thing to keep in mind is private industry and private shipbuilding does play a role in this game. So you can see your dock sizes expand as a result of the private economy. I'm not sure if export orders play a role in that or not, or if it's strictly random. But you will also, see alerts sometimes where there's exports that other countries want to buy your ships, and I believe it does play a role on your shipbuilding capacity or your dock size, because you can either accept it or decline it, but you don't really get money, it doesn't seem. At least that's not my experience. So I guess that's another thing we'll have to look at. But the next thing that we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and design our first ship. Now, before we go ahead and jump into the actual ship design, I think what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to split this video into 2 parts, because the actual ship design ended up taking about 20 minutes to begin with, as I kind of explain all the different features in it. It's actually pretty simple and not too intimidating, but again, I don't want to make this into like a 50-minute long video. So I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll cut this video off here. This was just kind of the basic intro to kind of the interface of the game. The gameplay will start, maybe not next episode, but the episode after that. We've still got to build our initial fleet. But this is kind of just a real first quick look at Rule the Waves. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and hope it wasn't too boring. I know this type of a game can have a little bit of a lengthy setup. So I appreciate you tuning in, and until next time, guys, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.